There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a piece of land you've owned for 22 years. It's not silence exactly. There's still wind moving through the cottonwoods, still cattle lowing somewhere past the tree line, still the creak of a windmill turning slow circles against the sky. But there's a stillness underneath all of that. A sense that this ground knows you, and you know it, and nothing about the arrangement needs explaining to anyone else. That stillness is gone now. And I want to tell you exactly how it disappeared, one gravel truck and one HOA newsletter at a time. My name doesn't matter for this story, but my land does. 240 acres of working ranch land in a county that used to be all ranches and is now half ranches, half a sprawling subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. I bought my place back when the land around it was still just land, scrub brush, mesquite, a few other ranchers who waved at you from their trucks and left it at that. Over the years, the developers came in, and Willow Creek Estates grew from a cluster of a dozen houses into nearly 400 homes, complete with a clubhouse, 2 swimming pools, and a homeowners association with more bylaws than some small towns have ordinances. I didn't mind the growth, not really. Land changes hands, communities grow, that's how it goes. What I did mind, what became the center of a fight I never asked for, was my driveway. See, when the original survey was done on my property back in the 90s, the county established my entrance road off the county highway. It's a long gravel drive, maybe 6/10 of a mile, that runs from the highway back to my house, barn, and working pens. It cuts along the edge of my property, close to the boundary line I share with what eventually became the back corner of Willow Creek Estates. For years, that boundary was marked with iron survey pins, exactly where the county surveyor had set them, exactly where they belonged. Then, sometime around 8 years ago, the pins started disappearing. I didn't think much of it at first. Pins get knocked out by cattle, buried by erosion, pulled up by accident during fence work. I noticed a couple were missing during a fence repair and figured I'd get them reset eventually. Ranch life doesn't leave a lot of room for urgency on paperwork problems when you've got real problems, sick cattle, broken equipment, whether that doesn't care about your schedule. But the missing pins weren't an accident. I understand that now. The trouble really started when Willow Creek Estates finished paving their internal roads. Their main entrance was on the far side of the development, a good 2.5 miles around by the county highway. But if you cut through the back corner of their property, past where the model homes used to be, you'd hit my gravel driveway, and my driveway connected directly to the county highway at a spot that shaved almost 4 miles off the drive into town for anyone living in the back third of the subdivision. At first, it was just a car or two. I'd be out checking cattle in the early morning and see a sedan I didn't recognize rolling down my gravel drive, slow and careful, like they weren't sure they were allowed to be there. I chalked it up to somebody's GPS sending them the wrong way. It happens more than you'd think out in the country. A phone insists there's a shortcut, and some poor soul in a rental car ends up in your hayfield. Then it became a pattern. Then it became several cars a day. Then it became landscaping trucks, moving vans, and eventually a small parade of golf carts from the Willow Creek Clubhouse, cutting across what I now realized was a corner of my land, using my private gravel entrance like it was a public thoroughfare. I finally caught up with one of the golf cart drivers, a retiree named Gerald, pleasant enough fellow, sunburned nose, HOA polo shirt, and asked him, politely, what exactly he thought he was doing driving through my driveway. "Oh, this is the shortcut," he said, like that explained everything. "Everybody uses it. Saves a good 15 minutes getting to the highway." "This is my private drive," I told him. "It leads to my house." He looked genuinely surprised, like the concept of private property was a fun bit of trivia he hadn't encountered before. Didn't realize. Well, no harm done, right? We are not bothering your cows or anything. I want to be clear that I wasn't unreasonable about this. I didn't chase him off with a shotgun or call the sheriff over one golf cart. I explained, calmly, that this was my land, my driveway, and I'd appreciate people not using it as a cut-through. Gerald nodded, apologized, and drove off. The next morning there were 4 cars on my drive before 8 a.m. I did what any reasonable person does when a problem starts small and might resolve itself with a little communication. I went to the source. I found out the HOA had a management office in the clubhouse, and I drove over one afternoon to talk to whoever was in charge. The woman behind the desk was named Denise, and she ran the day-to-day operations for the Willow Creek Estates HOA. I explained the situation, told her about the increasing traffic, the golf carts, the general assumption that my gravel driveway was some kind of community shortcut. Denise's response set the tone for everything that followed. "I hear you," she said, in the tone people use when they very much do not intend to do anything about what they've heard. "But that road's been used as a cut-through for years. It's kind of become part of the neighborhood culture at this point. People like the shortcut." "It's not a neighborhood road," I said. "It's a private ranch entrance." "Well, technically," Denise said, drawing the word out like it pained her, "there's some ambiguity about where exactly the property line falls back there. Some of our residents have looked into it, and there's, a grey area." There was no grey area. I'd owned that land for over 2 decades, paid taxes on every inch of it, and had an original county survey to prove exactly where my boundary sat. But I didn't have the survey pins anymore, because, as I'd later confirm, someone had been quietly pulling them for years, making it easier for anyone who wanted to argue about where the line actually was. I left that meeting with a bad feeling in my stomach, the kind you get when you realize you're not dealing with confusion, you're dealing with a strategy. Over the following months, things got worse in the particular way that problems get worse when there's an organization behind them instead of just individual bad actors. The HOA newsletter, I got a copy from a neighbor who still received it despite not being a member, actually referenced the scenic ranch route as a preferred path to the highway for residents in the back section of the neighborhood. There was no acknowledgement that this scenic ranch route was a private driveway belonging to an actual ranch with an actual owner who had actual cattle that occasionally needed to cross that exact stretch of gravel. The traffic increased. My cattle got spooked more than once by cars moving too fast down what they assumed was a public road. I had a delivery truck nearly clip one of my dogs. I had a moving van get stuck in a rain-softened section of the drive and leave deep ruts that took me a weekend to fix. And through all of it, when I complained, I got the same runaround from Denise and, eventually, from the HOA board itself, vague mentions of long-standing community use, implications that I was being difficult, and absolutely zero acknowledgement that this was, in fact, my land. I want to pause here and say something important, because I think it's the heart of why this situation dragged on as long as it did. When you own rural property, you get used to a certain kind of good faith. Neighbors help neighbors. Boundaries get respected because respecting them is simply what decent people do. I'd operated my whole life, and my whole ranching career, under that assumption. It took me embarrassingly long to accept that an organization made up of several hundred households, with its own management company and its own legal budget, does not operate on neighborly good faith. It operates on precedent. And the longer something goes unchallenged, the more precedent gets built, until eventually the people using your driveway genuinely believe they have a right to. That's when I decided to stop being polite about it and start being precise. The first thing I did was call the county surveyor's office and request a copy of the original plat and survey documentation for my property. It took a few weeks, but I got it, an official document, county stamped, showing exactly where my boundary lines fell, exactly where the original survey pins had been placed, and exactly how much of what people were treating as a grey area sat firmly and unambiguously on my side of the line. The second thing I did was hire a licensed surveyor to come out and re-establish those boundary markers. Not just verbally identify them, physically drive new, permanent survey pins into the exact coordinates specified by the county's original documentation. This wasn't a cheap undertaking. Professional survey work on 240 acres of boundary line isn't a weekend project, and it isn't free. But I'd reached the point where the cost of doing nothing had become higher than the cost of doing this properly. The survey crew came out on a bright, cool morning in October. I remember standing there with the lead surveyor, watching him set up his equipment, and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time regarding this whole mess: control. For years, I'd been reacting. Responding to golf carts, responding to newsletters, responding to Denise's vague deflections. This was the first thing I'd done that was entirely proactive, entirely mine, and entirely undeniable. It took the crew 2 full days to walk the boundary and reset every marker according to the original county coordinates. When they finished, my property line, including the section running alongside my gravel driveway, was marked with fresh, bright orange capped survey pins, driven deep, spaced exactly as the original 1990 survey specified, with GPS coordinates logged and a new certified plat map issued to match. For the first time in years, there was no ambiguity left anywhere on that boundary. None. I'll admit I took a certain quiet satisfaction in what happened next, though I tried not to let it turn into anything ugly. The very same week the new pins went in, I had a fence contractor come out and run a proper page wire fence directly along that boundary line, tied into the new survey markers, with a locking gate installed right where my gravel driveway crossed onto my property from a shared corner with Willow Creek Estates. No more assumptions. No more scenic ranch route. Just a fence, a gate, and a lock, sitting exactly where the county said my land began. The response was almost immediate. Within a week, I started getting calls, not from individual residents this time, but from the HOA's attorney, a man named Philip Rourke, who introduced himself with the practiced smoothness of someone used to being the most confident person in every conversation he's ever had. "We understand you've made some changes to the boundary area near the back corner of Willow Creek Estates," he said. "Our residents have expressed concern about losing access to a route they've used for community purposes for a number of years." "They've used a route that was never theirs to use," I told him. "That's private ranch property. It always has been." "There may be an argument for prescriptive easement," Rourke said, and I could practically hear him smiling through the phone, given the extended period of uninterrupted use by residents. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but by this point I'd done my homework, because I knew this conversation was coming. A prescriptive easement, for those unfamiliar, is a legal claim that can sometimes be made when someone has used a piece of another person's land, openly and continuously, for a long enough period, generally without the owner's permission and without the owner objecting or taking action to stop it. It's meant to formalize long-standing, unchallenged use into an actual legal right. Rourke was banking on the idea that my years of frustrated phone calls and unanswered complaints to Denise's office would count as passive tolerance. What he didn't know, what I made sure to correct him on very clearly, was that I had documentation. Every complaint I'd made to the HOA management office. Every email I'd sent. Every conversation, dated and logged, where I'd explicitly told residents, staff, and eventually the board itself that this use was not authorized and needed to stop. I've objected to this use in writing on no fewer than 11 separate occasions over the past several years, I told him. I have copies of every one of those objections. I don't believe uninterrupted, unchallenged use is going to hold up when I can produce a paper trail showing I challenged it constantly. There was a pause on the line. Just long enough for me to know I'd landed something. "I'll need to review those documents," Rourke said, in a noticeably less confident tone. "You're welcome to," I told him. "I'll have my attorney send them over." That last part wasn't a bluff. I had, by this point, hired my own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carol Ibsen who specialized in rural property and easement disputes. She'd handled cases like this before, and her advice from our very first meeting had been simple: document everything, formalize the boundary, and never, under any circumstances, let the other side control the narrative about long-standing use without a paper trail proving you'd fought it the whole way. Carol and I spent the next several weeks compiling everything: the original survey documents, the new certified plat, copies of every complaint I'd made, and statements from two of my longtime neighbors who could confirm they'd personally witnessed me asking HOA residents to stop using the drive on multiple occasions. We sent the full package to Rourke's office with a clear, unambiguous letter. The boundary was legally established. The survey pins were professionally reset according to official county coordinates. The driveway and surrounding land were unambiguously private property, and any further unauthorized use would be treated as trespassing, with law enforcement involvement if necessary. We also included something I was particularly proud of: a formal notice, prepared by Carol, informing the HOA that given the clear historical record of my objections, any attempt to claim a prescriptive easement would be vigorously contested in court, and that I would be seeking to recover legal costs given the documented, repeated nature of my prior objections. The HOA board meeting that followed, which I did not attend, but heard about in detail from two separate neighbors who did, apparently got heated. According to what I was told, several residents were furious to learn that the scenic ranch route they'd been using for years was, and always had been, someone's private driveway. Others were angrier still to learn that the HOA management office, under Denise's direction, had apparently known about my repeated objections for years and had done essentially nothing to stop residents from using the road, all while quietly promoting it in the community newsletter. There's a particular kind of reckoning that happens inside an organization when its members realize they've been casually trespassing on someone's ranch for years because nobody in charge wanted to deal with the paperwork of telling them to stop. From what I understand, it wasn't pretty. The HOA board ultimately decided not to pursue any legal claim regarding the driveway. Rourke, to his credit, seemed to have advised them fairly clearly that with a documented history of objections stretching back years, plus a freshly certified survey and a legally installed fence and gate, they had essentially no case. Pursuing it further would mean spending community association dues on a lawsuit they were very likely to lose, against a rancher with a complete paper trail and a licensed survey to back him up. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, cleanly, with an apology and everyone going back to minding their own business. Reality, as usual, was a little messier. There was a stretch of a few months where I still had the occasional car roll up to my locked gate, driver confused, phone GPS still stubbornly routing people down a road that no longer connected through. A few residents left irritated notes on the gate itself, one of which accused me, somewhat dramatically, of destroying the character of the neighborhood. I didn't respond to any of them. There wasn't much to say that the survey pins and the fence line hadn't already said far more clearly than I could. Denise, notably, stopped working for the HOA management company about 4 months after all this settled. I don't know the full story there, and it's not really my business, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little satisfied to hear it. Gerald, the golf cart retiree, actually stopped by my house on his own about 6 months later, on foot, no golf cart in sight, just to apologize. Said he genuinely hadn't understood the situation back when we first talked, and once the whole thing became public knowledge within the HOA, he felt embarrassed about how casually he and plenty of others had treated my land like a shared amenity. I appreciated that. Not everyone in this story was acting in bad faith. A lot of people were simply following an established pattern nobody had ever properly corrected, and once it was corrected, clearly, permanently, with pins in the ground and a fence around it, most people adjusted just fine. These days, my driveway is exactly what it's always legally been, mine. The gate stays locked except when I'm expecting deliveries or visitors. The survey pins sit exactly where the county says they belong, bright orange caps still visible against the dirt, a small, quiet, permanent statement about where one thing ends and another begins. I think about that period a lot, honestly. Not with anger anymore, that faded a while back, but with a kind of clarity about what I learned from it. Boundaries, whether they're property lines or something more personal, don't enforce themselves. Good intentions and neighborly patience will only get you so far before someone, or some organization, decides your patience is the same thing as permission. It took survey markers, a fence, a locked gate, and a very thorough paper trail to finally settle something that should have been simple from the very beginning. This is my land, and it was never anyone else's shortcut to take. The cattle don't get spooked by unfamiliar cars anymore. The gravel road stays quiet except for my own truck and the occasional visitor I've actually invited. And every time I drive past one of those fresh orange survey caps, I feel something settle in my chest, not quite triumph, but something close to it. A boundary, finally, that means exactly what it says. And that, for anyone dealing with something similar, a property line under quiet, gradual assault by people who've simply gotten used to treating your patients as their right, is the lesson I'd leave you with. Document everything. Object clearly, and in writing, every single time. And when you finally decide to draw the line for good, draw it properly, with pins in the ground that no one can argue with.